They tried to evict a soldier, but instead, they awakened a warrior in the courtroom. Before we dive into this powerful, true-to-life story, make sure you subscribe right now to the Untold Struggles. These stories shed light on the pain, resilience, and triumph of those who fight against injustice. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell, because you don't want to miss what's about to unfold. The story begins with David Carter, a 52-year-old black veteran of the U.S. Army. He served his country faithfully through 2 tours overseas. After decades of sacrifice, he finally bought his dream home in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Georgia. The house wasn't a mansion. It wasn't flashy. But for David, it was sacred ground, a place where he could finally rest, raise his teenage daughter Imani, and plant roots in a community he had worked his whole life to reach. But there was a problem. The neighborhood was ruled with an iron fist by the Homeowners Association, HOA, and at the top sat Richard Whitfield, a retired banker in his late 60s. Richard was known for his arrogance, his disdain for outsiders, and his obsession with keeping the neighborhood a certain way. From the moment David moved in, Richard made it clear, "You don't belong here." It started with letters. Cold, impersonal, written in legal jargon. One morning, David opened his mailbox and found a notice. "Your lawn does not meet HOA standards. Correct immediately or face fines." David shook his head. His lawn was freshly cut, trimmed perfectly. He had been meticulous. The Army had drilled that discipline into him. But the notice was only the beginning. Soon came others. His daughter's car parked incorrectly. A flagpole in his yard not permitted. A garden bed in violation of guidelines. It was harassment, plain and simple. And David knew why. Still, he remained calm. "Pick your battles, soldier," he told himself. He'd faced worse. But little did he know, the battle was only beginning. Behind closed doors, Richard began rallying other HOA members. At meetings, he used coded language. "We need to protect property values. This neighborhood has always had a certain standard. We can't let things change." Everyone knew what he meant, but not everyone agreed. A quiet tension spread among neighbors. Some whispered words of support to David when Richard wasn't around. Others crossed the street to avoid him, afraid of HOA backlash. And yet, David stood tall. His daughter Imani often asked, "Daddy, why are they doing this to us?" His reply was steady. "Because sometimes people fear what they don't understand. But we will not bow." It happened on a warm Saturday afternoon. David was working on his car in the driveway, humming to himself. Imani was inside studying for her exams. A black SUV pulled up. Out stepped Richard, flanked by 2 HOA board members. They carried clipboards, cameras, and smug expressions. "Mr. Carter," Richard barked, "we've documented several violations. At this point, we'll be forced to pursue eviction proceedings. This neighborhood has rules." David wiped his hands, stood tall, and looked Richard dead in the eye. "I fought for this country," he said calmly. "I bled for the right to own this home. You're not taking it away from me." Richard smirked. "We'll see about that." At that moment, Imani stepped outside. She saw her father surrounded. Her face tightened with fear. But David gave her a reassuring nod. He wasn't going to be intimidated. Not anymore. Family, before we continue, if you feel the weight of this struggle, if you've ever seen injustice and wanted to fight back, make sure you subscribe right now to the Untold Struggles. These stories matter, and your support keeps them alive. Now, let's return to the battle unfolding in this neighborhood. Weeks later, David received the official letter. Notice of eviction. Hearing scheduled. They weren't bluffing. The HOA had filed in court. Neighbors whispered, some in disbelief. Others shook their heads, too afraid to stand up. But Richard underestimated one thing. David Carter wasn't just a veteran. He was also a man with knowledge of the law. Years before, while recovering from injury, David had studied and earned his law degree. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a lawyer. And now, the battlefield was the courtroom. The courtroom buzzed with tension. On one side, Richard and his polished attorneys, dressed in expensive suits. On the other, David, calm, collected, wearing his simple suit, his daughter seated proudly behind him. Richard sneered, convinced victory was already his. But David carried something more powerful than arrogance. He carried truth. As the trial unfolded, David dismantled every accusation. The lawn violation was fabricated. Photos proved it. The car infraction was false. The HOA's own bylaws allowed it. The garden bed was pre-approved by a previous board. Piece by piece, Richard's case crumbled. And the judge? Watching closely, unimpressed by Richard's smug theatrics. Then came the turning point. David stood, holding a binder full of documents. His voice steady, commanding. Your Honor, this isn't about grass or cars. This is about discrimination. A pattern of targeted harassment designed to drive my family from our home. I defended this nation against enemies abroad, and now I'm forced to defend my family against injustice here. The courtroom fell silent. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Sweat dripped down his forehead. His lawyers whispered frantically. For the first time, the power shifted. David was no longer the victim. He was in control. The judge leaned forward. His voice echoed through the courtroom. Mr. Carter, I've reviewed the evidence. And I must say, this court does not tolerate discrimination, intimidation, or abuse of power. The HOA's motion to evict is denied. Gasps filled the room. Imani smiled through tears. David's fists clenched in victory. But the judge wasn't done. Furthermore, this court will investigate whether the HOA violated civil rights laws. Richard's face turned pale. His clipboard slipped from his hand. The war wasn't over. But David had won the first battle. And as he walked out of the courtroom with his daughter by his side, the camera of this story pans back, leaving us with the question. What happens when the HOA, furious at being exposed, decides to retaliate? Family, if this story shook you, if it reminded you that justice can prevail even when the odds are stacked against us, then don't just watch. Take action. Like, comment, share, and subscribe to the Untold Struggles. Let's keep telling the stories they don't want told. Because the fight isn't over, and part 2 is coming.